All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jorge Segura. I'm a SQL Server MVP. I'm a consultant with Pragmatic Works. I'm known online as SQL Chicken, hence the chicken there at the bottom. I've written on a couple of SQL titles, most recently the SQL Server 2012 Bible. And I've also founded a little project on my blog called SQL University, where folks can learn SQL Server from the ground up. And you can find that at sqluniversity.net. And that's a completely free resource for you to check out. All right, enough about me. So today we are talking about Windows Azure Virtual Machines. And this is a really cool offering from Microsoft. They've had this in kind of a beta mode for quite a while. And just recently they went RA, or whatever they call it, general release, GA. Now, today's session is called A Walk in the Clouds. If the title sounds familiar, it is not the Keanu Reeves Walk in the Clouds. I just want to throw it in there because, you know, more Keanu is always fun. Now, when we're talking about virtual machines, obviously we're talking about virtualization. So before we start talking about the cloud offerings, let's talk a little bit about the local virtualization and what that kind of entails today. So if you're doing virtualization locally, you kind of have to know and have to manage your own virtualization environment, right? And you've got quite a few options out there. You've got Hyper-V, which runs on the Windows Server platform. You have Client Hyper-V, which is actually built into Windows 8 now. You can use VMware's option. So VMware has their own server-level virtualization platform as well as a desktop level, right? Thing about this is you have to kind of know a little bit about virtualization. Let's say you're running it on your laptop. You got to know, go into the BIOS, enable virtualization, and then install the software, configure it, and then deal with all the stuff that virtualization comes with, right? Your host is your physical machine that you're going to be housing your VMs in, and that physical machine has CPU and memory that the virtual machines are going to be using. You have to configure networking and understand how the networking works between VMs and what the difference in the different virtualization or networking options are. I actually did a webinar previously, which we have up on our archives, about setting up a private lab, so you can check that out to understand different networking topologies. Also storage. Again, if we're talking about on your local laptop, you're fighting with the OS, you're fighting with all the files that you're saving locally, as well as all the VMs. What if, in like my case, where I have a solid state drive but I have very limited space? Well, I could put all my VMs on an external drive, and that can get cumbersome. What if I forget my drive somewhere? Oh crap, that's what all my demos are based off of, so what do? And then finally, knowledge. Virtualization is extremely cool technology, and they have made it quite a bit easier nowadays, especially with the desktop options, to get up and running. But there's still quite a bit of knob turning and configuration that you have to know about and set up so you can get up and running. Now, when we're talking about local virtualization, I made that presentation on creating your own kind of private lab environment because there's a lot of stuff that's just, it's coming down the pipeline, and maybe our organizations aren't quite on the bleeding edge like we'd like to, but we don't want our skills to get stagnant, right? Well, if your environment, if your employer is still running Windows Server 2003, and we have 2012 R2 coming out very soon, you want your skills to be up on the latest. So one way you could do this is stand up a virtual machine either on your laptop or somewhere at work. If your employer has some sort of environment that allows for it, stand up and play with it, right? Get to know the OS, the different new features. Same thing with SQL Server. SQL Server, we have SQL Server 2014 that's recently been announced, and we want to be able to get our hands on it and play with the new bits and see what's on the horizon. But are those resources available to us? Well, that's where Azure comes in. And Windows Azure Virtual Machines are a perfect solution for this, right? One, it's extremely easy. As we're going to see today, the interface for Azure makes things really, really simple and really easy to follow. All right? And it's scalable. Now, what I mean by this is Windows Azure as a whole has a bunch of different options. Virtual machines are not the only things you can do in Azure. You can do websites, you can do mobile services, you can do networks, you can do a whole slew of things. When we're talking about virtual machines, however, the service offering is called infrastructure as a service, meaning that we can spin up a piece of infrastructure. In this case, it's a server, right? We're just spinning up a server with a couple of clicks. And it makes it really easy for us to scale up and out. Availability, and this is what's really nice, it's in the cloud. So today's demo, I'm on my laptop, and I'm going to log into the Azure portal, and I'm going to show you stuff there. But what happens if this laptop craps out? Well, easy. I just go to another laptop that has, or another machine that has internet connectivity, and I log into the portal, and I'm able to do everything I can do in Azure from any machine. It's my data available to me anywhere, anytime. And also, Microsoft, when you set this stuff on the back end, they actually have a 3 nines availability that they guarantee you. Now, flexibility, and this is what's really cool about virtual machines and virtualization in general, is you can just kind of put anything you want on it. But the nice thing about Azure virtual machines is that they support all these different options. You can spin up a Windows server. They do support Linux server. And yes, strangely enough, recently they have announced that they now support Oracle on the Windows Azure platform. So if you're a DBA, and this is extremely common, where you're not only supporting SQL Server, but you're supporting Oracle as well, spin up a VM with Oracle on it, or spin up a Windows VM and install Oracle on it in Azure, play with the new bits, get to know the stuff, and that way you're that much better professional. And finally, value. All right. So Windows Azure machines, they have different pricing structures, and we're going to see this in a minute. And recently, they've adjusted some of the pricing, and they continue to adjust pricing based on customer demands and needs. So prices over the last 2 years have just been dropping, and Microsoft has been very, very aggressive about this. Now, if you have an MSDN subscription, and a lot of companies do have these, the nice thing that you can do is you can use Azure with your MSDN subscription. You just have to activate your Azure benefits. Now, what we see here on screen are the different types of MSDN subscriptions that you can have. And what they do is, the new way is that depending on your MSDN subscription, you get basically an allowance. So the highest there, the Visual Studio Ultimate with MSDN, you get $150 worth of credits for Azure. If you do the middle of the road, you get 100. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll see this in a second. Each of the different services have different pricing structures. So, for example, storage, they charge you by the gigs per month. In virtual machines, they actually charge you for how long they're up and running. All right. Now, here's another chart that shows the different pricing structures for the different VMs. When we spin up a VM in Azure, you can choose from different template sizes. So here we have extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large. Now, based on the sizes, you get different things. You get a different number of virtual cores, or virtual CPUs, if you will. You get a different amount of memory. And based on the size of the VMs that you get, you also get a different price per hour. So you can see that the smallest VM charges 2 cents per hour as long as that VM is up and running. And the most expensive one you have is the extra large, and they charge 72 cents an hour. Now, how do we figure out how much that's going to cost us? Well, the nice thing is that there's a nice little calculator that Microsoft has provided, and we're going to jump to that real quick. So on the Windows Azure website, which is windowsazure.com, we can get to this calculator. And this calculator, as you can see, there's, I mentioned earlier, there are all different types of services that Azure offers. But today we're going to focus on the virtual machines. Now, as we scroll down here, we see that there's a little slider here for just virtual machines. Now, this virtual machine here, this slider at the top, is just for a vanilla Windows server, right? No applications installed on it. However, we're SQL Server people, right? So we want to know what the pricing will be like a Windows Azure VM with SQL Server on it. So we're actually going to come down here to the SQL Server sliders. Now, the nice thing here is that it breaks it out depending on what version or what edition of SQL Server we want to use. So if you're going to be using a virtual machine that's going to be public-facing, let's say you're doing a website application or something that's going to be public-facing, you're going to want to use the web edition because that's the one that's licensed for public use. However, let's say you just want to create an application that's just going to be private for you and your company, or you're just playing around. You'll want to look at the standard or enterprise licensing here. So let's take a look at what a standard VM would look like. So we're going to choose the small, so based on that chart we saw earlier, and as you choose your different sizes, it tells you what the different differences are between the small, medium, large. So this one is 1.6 gigahertz CPU with 1.75 gigs of RAM. Now, if I adjust this slider, it tells me, all right, I'm going to have one VM, and since I chose a small, it's going to be charging us 64 cents an hour. That's based on the edition and the size. And this number here is how much it costs to have that VM running 24/7 for an entire month. Okay? So with this calculator, if you were going to sit down with your company and try to figure out, okay, we want to take all our development environments and maybe put them in Azure just to try it out. Well, let's say you had 10 different servers, keep them at small, all right, 1. You can see that the calculator there adjusts. Now, depending on your environment, your licensing, your resource usage, yada yada, this may actually save you money. All right. So you can come here and you can play with this calculator, and it'll give you an idea of how much money it'll cost to run your environment in Azure. Now, remember, this price here is assuming you have this thing up and running 24/7 for a month. With the new pricing changes that have happened recently with Azure, when you shut that virtual machine down, it's no longer charging. All right, so the charges stop when the VM stops. So if you're going to do a development environment now in Azure, what you can do is you can have it shut down at the end of the day. That way you don't get charged overnight, and you can save yourself some more money. All right, so when we're talking about VMs, we're going to talk about the different resources that make up a VM. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is storage. So we've talked about building the VM, but when you create a VM, the virtual machine itself is nothing more than a file that you need to put on storage somewhere. Well, in Azure, they have these storage containers. And these containers can contain all sorts of things. So you can put blobs, so it can just be a general storage container for you. You can actually put tables out there. So if you've looked at SQL Server 2012 recently, you can see that you can actually connect to your Azure storage containers directly from Management Studio. And in coming versions of SQL Server, you can actually do backups directly to your Azure containers. Now, I will tell you that's probably not the fastest option, but it's kind of cool that they're mixing the worlds together in that kind of hybrid scenario that you have. You can also do queue services, and that's more of a development thing that I'm not really a developer. Now, this part is cool. When you create a storage container in Azure, you can choose redundancy. So when you're creating something in Azure, you choose what location it's going to go to. And we're going to see this when we create a VM in just a few minutes. So you can choose a data center or a region. And within that region, what you can do is you can choose, when you create your storage container, you can tell it, I want this storage container to be locally redundant, which means that they will automatically replicate that storage blob to another server somewhere within your region. Or you could do geographically redundant, which, let's say you wanted to do a little more protection. Actually, I'm sorry, locally redundant is within the same data center. Geographically redundant would be somewhere in the same region, but not necessarily the exact same place as your primary. Now, the reason for this, let's say server needs to go down for maintenance, or something happens to the SAN that happens to be hosting your storage container. Well, with that redundancy, Azure has kind of a high availability option built in for you. Now, in smaller businesses, do you have that sort of redundancy option available to you? Maybe, maybe not. And that's kind of the cool thing about Azure is that it gives you enterprise level features, but at a reduced cost. And it's super simple. It's just a matter of checking a box to get that sort of redundancy. Now for storage, this is the storage pricing, and it tells you for the first terabyte per month. For geographically redundant, you have, what is that, 9.5 cents per gig. If you just do locally redundant, it's 7 cents per gig. And again, we can make use of the calculator. So we scroll up here to the calculator, we can go to data management, and we can look at our storage sizes here and start, that's quite a bit. So 2.4 terabytes would cost us $207 a month in a geo-redundant storage setup in Azure. If we do the same size here, 2,400, locally redundant, it's $161 a month to keep that sort of storage running. Now, you'll also get a charge per transaction. As you can see there at the bottom, they'll charge you 1 cent per 100,000 transactions. If you want to read more on the details, you can check out the storage pricing page, and they have lots of FAQs out on the Azure website. All right, next we're going to talk about the networks. Now, the cool thing about the virtual machines is that you not only can they talk to each other in Azure, you can actually make them connect to your local network or your local machines. So you can get kind of a hybrid environment. So let's say I wanted to test out replication. Well, I could set up a virtual machine on my local laptop. I could spin up a VM in Azure, set up an endpoint between the two, and then I'm able to connect from my local machine out to Azure without a problem. Now, I'm not going to set this specific configuration today, but I will show you how I can connect from my local laptop to my Azure virtual machine in just a little bit. Now, the virtual networks is really interesting, and there's a lot of options. We're not going to go into it all, but I did link to all the different pages that talk about the virtual networks. So you can actually set up a point-to-point option. Basically, it sets up a kind of a VPN connection between a specific endpoint on your local machine or a machine on your local network out to the VM or VMs out in Azure. Or you could do a site-to-site. So let's say you wanted to spin up a number of machines out in Azure and join them to a local domain. You know, again, going back to that example where I want to take my development environment, put it out in Azure instead of using my local resources, I could do that and still join it to my local domain. Azure also offers load balancing, so there's a tutorial there for how to set the load balancing up if you guys are any web developers out there. And there's lots of tutorials around the networks, and again, that's linked. This slide deck, I'm going to be sending it to our marketing director after this presentation, and I will also be posting the deck out on SQLchicken.com. So don't worry if about missing these links and this stuff that I'm showing today. All right, next we're going to talk about Affinity Groups. So I've spun up a VM in my data center, and you can, as we've already seen, I've got a VM, I've got storage, I've got network, but as you create these resources, they may not necessarily be in the exact same place. So going back to my local example, on my local laptop, if I create a VM, my storage, my CPU, my memory, my network, they're all on my local laptop. However, when I create stuff in Azure, I tell it where I want it to be. So I can spin up a VM that's somewhere in the East region. I can do a storage container that's contained somewhere in the US West region. And I can link the two together, but you probably don't want to do that just for performance reasons, because every time that the VM, needs to make a call to that storage container, it's got to go across country and make the calls there and go back and forth. So what you want to do is you create what are called affinity groups. An affinity group is where think of it as another container, and you tell it within this affinity group, I want my storage, my VM, my network, all in the same place or as close to each other as possible. Now, this is recommended for performance reasons, so the closer you get everything together into the same data center, theoretically the faster things are going to go. They don't have the latency issues that are going to be present if you start separating the resources. All right. Now, if you're familiar with virtualization at all, a cluster, you have your physical machines that are hosting your VMs. Those are called your hosts. Well, you can cluster all those hosts together so that way your VMs can travel within those physical machines. So that way, if one physical machine needs to go down for maintenance, the VMs can move over to another machine that's already up, and that way you don't have any downtime. So what affinity groups are going to try to do is they're going to try to put all your resources within the same cluster in a single data center. All right. Next are availability sets. So the previous one gave us the ability to, that option was for performance, but what if we're worried about high availability? Now, if I spin up a VM by itself and don't specify an availability set, what happens is my virtual machine gets spun up on a single host or physical machine somewhere in a data center somewhere. But what happens if that host needs to go down for maintenance? All right, what's going to happen to my machine? Well, if I don't have a high availability set set up, what happens is my machine is going to be shut down along with the host. All right. So what you want to do if you need high availability is you create an availability set. What that's going to specify is that this VM will now be kind of mirrored or given the option to move over to another host within that cluster. Remember the cluster I talked about a second ago? So if host 1, if we're looking at the image there, host 1 on the left needs to go down for maintenance, my VM can move over to host 2 on our right and still be up. Now, you shouldn't see any outage. It should move over seamlessly, but that is an option given to you. Again, it's just a couple of clicks to get this kind of high availability set up. And for small businesses who may not have virtualization expertise or whatnot, this is a great option to keep things simple and keep things up and running, especially if your business depends on it. Also, setting up an availability set lets you avoid a single point of failure. If you don't set up an availability set and your machine goes down, what's that going to do for your business or your processes? Now, Microsoft is not going to shut down your VM without telling you. Just last week, I got an email saying, hey, we're going to be doing some maintenance that's going to be affecting VMs. If you have VMs that are up and running that are not configured in an availability set, they will have an outage. And Microsoft does the best to perform these outages overnight when typically the customer isn't using it. So if you are running overnight stuff and you know that's going to happen, plan accordingly or configure your availability sets. All right, so enough yapping. Let's see how all this stuff actually works. All right, so we're going to come over here and we're going to go to the Windows Azure portal. So this is the portal for Windows Azure, and as I mentioned before, there are all sorts of different services that are offered by Azure. All right, you can see here we have websites, virtual machines, mobile services. Let's take a look at storage here. So we're going to take a look at the different pieces that make up the VM before we actually go creating our VM. So the storage is just simply a container. All right, so if we wanted to do a new storage, down here on the left, I'm going to click New and click Create. Now, everything in Azure gets a public name. So what I can do is I can do SQL Chicken Storage, and you can see here that the green check mark they do a quick check to make sure that that name that you just chose isn't already taken. So nobody else is using SQL Chicken Storage right now, so I get the green check mark. And you can also see here core.windows.net. So this is going to be a public URL. All right. Now, not to say that when you create this, the entire world is going to be able to hack into your blob. That's not the case. It's just that this is creating a name on their end so you can identify this particular resource. Next, you can see here the location or affinity group. So I talked about this in the slide deck. You can choose one of two things. You can choose just the location. So you can see that we have data centers in the east and west U.S. and all these different data centers around the globe. All right. I can choose to just throw my resource out into a region, and I don't care what host it ends up. However, what if I've created an affinity group and I want to make sure that all of my stuff stays together? Well, if you've created an affinity group ahead of time, it's going to show up on this list. And previously I created an affinity group called the A team. So we're going to choose that. Finally, you choose your subscription. So when you sign up for Azure, it's actually a subscription-based service. And up at the top here, we can see that I've got a couple different subscriptions applied to my account, but we're using the Visual Studio Ultimate account here. All right. So if I went ahead and created the account, it would create it just like this. So we're going to look at the JD Cigar one, and you can see I've got 3 different storage containers available to me. All 3 of them right now happen to be in the East US data center. All right. So let's go to virtual machines. Now, the beauty of this is the simplicity. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to click New down here at the bottom left, and I'm going to get this nice little screen. And I've got 2 options. I can do Quick Create, which just lets me spin up a VM very quickly, or I can choose from a gallery. And the gallery is really, really nice because they're templates that are available to us that have some software already pre-installed for us. So we can see out here, I can take a look at Windows Server 2012 Data Center Edition, the newly announced Windows Server 2012 R2 preview. They've got a template out there for that. 2008 R2 SP1. You can put up a SharePoint 2013 trial. So if you want to cut your teeth on SharePoint, you can simply spin up a VM with it already installed there for you. Now for the real cool stuff for SQL Server, check this out. We've got some templates already built for us for the newly announced SQL 2014 CPP1 Evaluation Edition. And not only that, and this is a little hard to see, but this second one down, it's not only the new SQL Server, it's the new Windows Server 2012 R2. All right. So I want to learn all the latest and greatest, so I'm going to choose the second one because I want to see what the new server stuff is about, and I want to see what the new SQL Server stuff is all about. So I'm going to hit this arrow for next. Now, we're going to name this virtual machine. Now, let's see. What are we going to call this? I've already got one out there. Let's go with Game of Thrones. I'm going to call it Arya. Now, I showed you earlier the sizing and the differences between the VMs. Now, in addition to the CPU and memory, you're also going to get some IOPS differences between the versions. And again, you can read up more on the documentation on the Azure website. So if you're going to try to put out a very busy transactional system, you're going to want to go with one of the larger ones. Again, read up the documentation to see exactly what's going to fill your need. For this demo, we're just going to choose a small one. Next, we're going to choose a username. Now, this is the username for the account that's going to log into Windows Server. All right, so we're just going to, I'm going to put my name in there. All right, so this is the account, not SQL Server, but the Windows user that's going to log into the machine. I'm going to hit next. And next, we're going to choose some more configurations here for the virtual machine itself. Now, we're going to create a new cloud service. Uh-oh, it looks like somebody else already had my idea. I tried to use a character from Game of Thrones. Somebody already has a VM out there called Arya. So I'm going to give it a number 44, and now I've got my green check mark. Nobody else is using Arya 44. Subscription, I mentioned earlier, you choose which description you've got. Much like the storage, you're gonna tell it where this resource is going to be placed. Now, for performance reasons, I'm going to stick everything involved with this into my Affinity Group. Now, VMs, I mentioned, have storage accounts associated with them because the VM itself is just a file. It needs to go somewhere. So here it asks you, what storage account do you want to place this VM with? Now, if I wanted to, I could choose one of the ones that I've already created here. And I know that those three right there are all in my Eastern data center, and that's fine. But if I didn't want, let's say I didn't have any storage accounts created yet, I could choose this use an automatically generated storage account option, and what it's going to do is it's going to give me a name very much like this. So it'll be Portal VHD, or in this case it'll probably be Arya 44, and then with a bunch of random letters and names after it. I'm a little OCD because I'm a DBA, so I don't like messy names. So I like creating my storage account manually ahead of time, so that way I can associate it and I know exactly where this thing's going to go. So I'm just going to put this under JD Cigar. All right. So I've got my options set. I'm going to hit next. Now this is where I choose my availability set. And we talked about the availability sets earlier. If you happen to forget, there's this gray little question mark that's available right next to it, and the pop-outs will tell you exactly what availability set means in case you forget. These little pop-outs are available all over the Azure interface, which makes it really nice and easy and user-friendly. All right. Now, for the time being, I'm not going to choose an availability set. Now, this option here is an interesting one. You can actually enable Windows PowerShell remoting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these are just virtual machines out in the cloud somewhere. But you're able to still run PowerShell commands against it because it's just a server. So what here, we're telling it I want to enable PowerShell remoting, so if I wanted to play with scripts locally that spin up VMs in Azure for me, I could do that. All right, so we're going to leave that enabled. Finally, we're going to hit that check mark for complete, and now we're up and running. Now, you see here that it got a status of starting to provision my VM out where I told it to. You can also see that this is the DNS name. All right, that's that public name that I talked about. Now, it's going to take a few minutes for this thing to spin up, and down here at the bottom right, we've actually got a little counter that's going, and we can click on that, and that tells you the progress of any activities going on in your Azure account. So here we can see it's creating the virtual machine. I can hit details, and we can see the exact steps of where we are with setting up that VM. All right. Now, like any good cooking show, I just popped in the thing into the oven, and I'm going to pull out a completed product now. So this is a VM that I've already created using the exact same templates that we saw earlier. It's got Server 2012 R2 with SQL Server 2014 CTP1. Now, I could do one of two things. As you can see, I've clicked on it to highlight it. So down here at the bottom, I can hit the Connect button. When I hit that, it's going to warn me, hey, this thing is going to open up an RDP file. That's cool. So I'm going to open up that file, and what that's going to do is that's going to launch remote desktop for me, and it's going to pass the information. So I'm going to put in the password for that account that I created. Remember that we created an account to log into Windows. I'm going to pass it. It's just telling me there's a certificate associated with this. We're just going to accept the certificate. And now we're going to RDP into the server just like any other server. All right. Now, I was on the server earlier, so I've got a few windows already open. But, we've got ourselves a server up and running in the cloud. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is the new Server 2012 R2. So what are some of the cool new things? Look at this. The start button's back. Hooray! All right. So if you haven't worked with the kind of Windows 8 Metro-y interface, it's a little strange. All right. So with 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1, we've now got this little down arrow here at the bottom. I'm going to click that, and that's going to show me all my apps. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to find my SQL Server ones. So Management Studio and my connection ones are the ones I'm going to use the most. So I'm going to right-click this icon. And I'm going to tell it to pin to the taskbar. I'm going to right-click it again and do pin to start. All right. And when I pin to start, it gives me my icon here. So there's one more that I like to pin to start is the SQL Server configuration. I'm going to pin that to my start as well. And to launch it, you simply click on it. And I've already got it open here. So as we can see here, this is a fully functioning SQL Server instance. No smoke and mirrors, folks. This is 2014 running out on a VM. Now, I've got this thing up and running. It's really cool. But what if I don't want to RDP into the server every time I want to use SQL Server? All right. How do we make this possible? Well, there's a couple things. One, there's a tutorial out when you first log into the server. Let me minimize the windows here. When you first log into a server that's created using that template, you've got the shortcut here to getting started with SQL Server, and what that's going to do is that's going to open up this page here out on the Windows Azure website. And if we scroll down a little bit, there's a link how to connect to the instance of SQL Server in a Windows Azure virtual machine. And it's got this little checklist here for you to configure this. Now, by default, we know SQL Server runs on port 1433. So that's already running for you, and that's configured through the configuration manager here. Next, open TCP ports in the Windows Firewall. So I'm going to come here and start typing in Firewall, open up my Firewall, and what I did was for inbound rules, I created a new rule that allowed connections into port 1433. Configure SQL Server for mixed mode authentication. We know how to do that. We go to the properties for SQL Server, security, and change it to mixed mode. And then finally, I created a new SQL login called Hodor. All right, and that's actually the name of my VM as well. Now, this next one is really one of the most important pieces, is create a TCP endpoint for the virtual machine. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to minimize the RDP, and we're going to go back to our Azure portal page here. Now, I'm going to click on the arrow for Hodor to drill down a little bit more into some of the options I can do here. Now, this is the dashboard. The dashboard into a VM gives you some nice resources and tutorials for you to follow. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose endpoints here. Now, by default, because I chose the Powershell endpoint, it created this endpoint for Powershell and the specific port that it was going to be using. It enabled the remote desktop endpoint because otherwise I wouldn't be able to get to my VM. And this one is one that I created manually. And this is my TCP endpoint for SQL Server. Now, to create your endpoint, it's simple. You just come down here to Add, and then you follow these simple menus. So we're just going to add an endpoint. You're going to give it a name. You're going to choose which protocol, and then the ports that are associated with it. So here I just created a SQL Server endpoint for 1433 because that's the database engine. If you're going to be using another service, you're going to figure out what port or configure which port. And then finally, determine the DNS name of the virtual machine. Again, going back to here, we've got our DNS names, and we can see that I've got a name of hodor.cloudapp.net. All right. So we've got all the pieces in place. So I'm going to open up my local management studio. This is my SQL Server 2012 Management Studio opening up on my local laptop. And what we're going to do now that we've opened it is we are going to connect to my virtual machine in the cloud. So here for the server name, I give it the DNS name, hodor.cloudapp.net. The authentication method, we're going to be using SQL Server. And then finally, give it the credentials for Hodor. I'm going to connect. And voila, I'm connected to my SQL Server instance running in Azure. So now I can, with my local management studio, I can play around, create new databases out on my server. We can take a look at all the new stuff. Check this out, compatibility levels. All right, it looks like for the 2014, they haven't put in the 2014 compatibility level yet. It's good to know. We're going to hit OK. And now I can do all sorts of fun stuff that I would normally do on a local instance. But the difference is that this guy is now hosted in the cloud. So I can get to my data, I can get to my server anytime, anywhere. Now if we look back at this portal, check this out. ARIA is now done. So in the time that I just did that demo, my new VM is now up and running. Now I'm going to hit connect. It's going to give me my RDP prompt again. And now we are remoting into my newly built server, ARIA. And since this is the first time I'm logging into the server, you get that screen there. It's going to show me all the stuff. And voila, we've got ourselves a new server, a new playground to play with. All right. So I'm going to wait for that. Now, let's say, remember earlier I talked about VMs. They're charged based on how long they're up and running. Well, I can do one of two things. I can come in here to Hodor, and I can try to log off the machine the normal way. Go here to local server, task. I can shut down the local server. I could do that. I could also do it from here. It's the charms menu on the right. If you're, again, there's a little weird. You can go to charms menu, settings, and then I could choose shutdown, or I'm just going to disconnect because I don't want to shut down from within the VM right now. But that's going to kill my RDP connection, but I want to shut down Hodor, so I'm just going to come down here in the web interface and hit shutdown. And it's telling me that the virtual IP address that was assigned to the virtual machine is about to be released. Now the reason for this is because Hodor is using DHCP, and that's fine. I'm not dependent on the service right now, so I'm just going to hit yes, and that's fine. And again, my little status icon tells me that Hodor is currently shutting down. All right. And that is the quick and dirty of Azure, all right, and with the virtual machines. And there's a lot more you could do with it. So when you create the virtual machines, if we look at the setup here, there's more advanced stuff that we could do. So by default, you get a C drive here and a D drive with temporary storage. Now, I will tell you now, when you spin up a VM, don't put anything in this temporary storage that you don't want lost. All right, because when every time you turn the VM on and off, this guy there's no guarantee that what you put in there is going to be there. All right, this is a non-persistent disk. C drive is persistent, so anything that you want to put on and save, create a folder in here. All right, but let's say that you wanted to add more disks to this VM. Well, you can do that. All right. But you're going to have to shut down the VM, and what we can do is we've got this option down here for attach. Now when we click attach, you get a couple options. You can attach a disk, which is an existing disk, or we can attach an empty disk. All right. So let's just do an empty disk. Now, it knows that it's going to be associated to ARIA. The storage location, it's going to choose the storage location which the VM is currently residing on. And then it gives you just a random file name. I'm not going to, just for the sake of sanity. All right, and next we're going to choose the size. All right, so this is going to be an empty disk, but I'm just going to choose 1 gig just so we can see this. Now, for this disk, you choose what kind of caching you want with it. So you could do read-only, so you're just going to do, let's say you need a drive to put flat files on for SSIS, and you know that you're only going to ever be reading from these files. You could do a read-only cache, or if you're going to be doing a new drive that you know you're going to put SQL Server data files or transaction log files. Anything SQL Server related, use the read-write cache option. Don't use any of these other ones, okay? And again, if you get confused, you can mouse over the little question mark there, and it gives you a nice little pop-out and a description of what the different things are. All right, and there's also a nice white paper available from the SQL Cat team. Their website is SQLcat, SQLCAT.com. They've got a white paper on building virtual machines with SQL Server for performance, and they talk about all these caching options as well. So I'm going to hit OK, and what that's going to do is now it's creating a 1 gig file in my storage location, in my blob, and it's going to attach it to this VM. And again, we can click on my little status here to see what's happening. All right, so Hodor just got successfully shut down, so I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to clear it from the status there. And for the attaching, it's going to take a minute. And once this is done, once we go back here, we're going to be able to come here and see our new disk once it's completed attaching that disk to the VM. And again, lots of options you can do here. The maximum I believe you can do with disks that you can attach are 1 terabyte disks to each VM. And again, depending on the size of VM you create, it limits the amount of disks that you can attach to it. And again, those details are available out on the Windows Azure website for virtual machines, so you can read more about it. The other nice thing about this interface is, let's say I'm here in virtual machines and I'm completely lost. Well, down here at the right, this little question mark will give you help, and it'll tell you all about the different options you have here. So right now, because I clicked on storage, it gave me my help for storage, but if I'm focused on virtual machines, it gives you a nice little walkthrough here. Talks about how to create your virtual machines, and it links you to the tutorials available on the Windows Azure website. The Affinity Groups tells you about them, stopping and starting VMs, and from here it gives you all the different options available to you. Now, you can see here that Hodor is now shut down and it says deallocated. If I wanted to, I could actually delete this VM. I'm not going to do it just because I like demoing with Hodor, but if I wanted to get rid of them, I would just click delete, and it would get rid of this from my account. All right, so it looks like my disk got done attached to ARIA. We're going to come back here real quick and look at disks. And right now it's reading all the disks that are associated with this. And we can see that I've got my new, all right, right now I don't have anything here. However, I've got this new disk here. We're going to right click, make it a new volume. We're just going to choose all the default options. I want to format the entire thing. I'm going to give it a drive letter F. Doesn't matter what drive letter you give it. You can choose your file system type. Now with Server 2012, we got introduced to a new file system type called REFS. Currently, SQL Server does not support the REFS volume, so choose NTFS if you're going to be putting any SQL Server related files on there. All right. So let's just choose NTFS. We can label it, hit next, create, and just like you would do on a normal server, it's going to take that disk space, format it, and now we've got a new volume, a new 1 gig disk volume that we can do whatever we want with here. All right. So as you can see, Azure is extremely simple to get around and to spin up different VMs and different options that normally maybe wouldn't be quite as easy or as user-friendly to do on a local setup. All right. Now, this is my contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Or if you're interested in our consulting services, you can contact sales@pragmaticworks.com. I'm on Twitter as SQL Chicken and my blog at sqlchicken.com. And again, this slide deck will be uploaded after the presentation up to the website. And I will be offering, or I'll be giving this deck to our marketing person, so you can also get it from them as well. Thank you guys very much.